The next series we're going to be covering is female reproduction in sheep and goats, and we're going to walk through the estrus cycle, the anatomy and physiology first, the estrus cycle, and then some of the technologies used in reproduction in small ruminant production. So we're going to first cover anatomy, then we're going to talk about the hormonal regulation of reproduction and the estrus cycle, and talk about the hormonal changes and how that all fits together with the technologies that we use. The first thing is that we need to cover some basic data. And we need to understand the age at puberty, which is generally around 6 months, but there can be a range, and it definitely depends on breed and type and all of that. We also need to know the length of the estrus cycle, and I just realized I had that spelled wrong. Estrus, meaning the cycle, is spelled with an O-U-S. And so in sheep, it's about 16-17 days. In goats, it's about 20 to 21 days. And so sheep are the only ruminant species that I can think of that run a 16-17 day cycle. Cattle, goats, and the other ones are generally around the 21-day mark. Standing estrus, generally for about 30 hours in sheep, a little bit longer in goats. And when we talk about the ovulation after the onset of standing heat, it's about 24 hours in sheep and about 36 hours in goats. The average gestation length is about 5 months in both species. Sheep tend to be 2 to 3 days shorter than goats. And then the ovulation rate in terms of eggs ovulated each time, that's kind of where we're at there. And the big ones are puberty, the days of the estrus cycle, and the ovulation and gestation. So let's start breaking this down. When we take a look at the reproductive tract in the female, you have two images. One shows the basic anatomy on the left in terms of if you were looking down on top of the animal, where you have the external component, the vulva, moving into the vagina, the cervix, the uterus, the uterine horns, the fallopian tubes into the ovary. On the image on the right, you can see it from a side view and how it lays in the animal's body. So let's talk about each of those anatomical parts and keep them in mind as we're going through these definitions. The ovaries are the egg-producing component of the reproductive tract. They produce the ova, and they also secrete female hormones, including estrogen and progesterone. And we'll talk about how those play into the estrus cycle in a future video. Once the ovary ovulates and the ova are released, the oviduct, or the fallopian tube, catches the egg. It's like the catcher's mitt. And that is the actual site of fertilization and early embryonic development as the embryo moves through the fallopian tubes into the uterine horn. Once we get into the uterus, this is where the embryo will develop into the fetus, and it's going to provide the protection and nourishment to that growing embryo as it develops. And there's two major parts, the body and the horns. Inside the uterus is an inner lining with little button-like projections known as caruncles. And that is what the placenta will attach to, and that's how blood supply and nourishment is going to get to the, hopefully, two fetuses inside the female as they develop. From there, we go to the cervix, and that is the major separation unit between the uterus and the vagina. And actually, during pregnancy, it'll seal off to protect that embryo and fetus from the external environment. And so to make sure it's safe, secure, and getting the nourishment that it needs to develop to the best of its ability. Next, we have the vagina, which actually connects the cervix to the external opening to the female reproductive tract, the vulva. That's going to make up the first video. The next video is going to dig in a little bit more.